Luke chapter 6, and I'm going to read from verse 46 through to chapter 7 and verse 10. Now this is two accounts, two stories or two happenings. One is a story that Jesus told, and one is an event that happened. And Luke puts the two together. And I think he does that very deliberately. In fact, he tells us that the second one happened straight after the first. And that's a slightly different order to what Matthew gives, but I don't think we've got any real reason to doubt that what Luke is doing is he's saying that there's no coincidence that the second event happened straight after Jesus had been teaching on this particular subject. So here we go. So it's Luke chapter 6, verse 46. Through to 7 and verse 10. Okay. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? I will show you what he is like, who comes to me and hears my word and puts them into practice. He's like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. And when a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it, because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. When Jesus had finished saying all this in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum, and there a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. And the centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. And when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turned to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. And then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Well, I don't know about you, but I always love reading the inspiring stories of other people. It's the thing that makes biographies so popular. And I have got a whole host of biographies sitting on my bookshelves of both Christian and secular people. And I have to say that I have seldom actually read any of them. It's one of those things, I have the good intention that I will read that particular biography of this person, and so I see it somewhere, and I pick up the book and say all the best will in the world, and there it stays. But there was a time when I used to have a bit more time for reading other people's stories. I don't know what happens to the time these days, but it doesn't seem to be much time at all. Not for pleasure reading. But I used to love reading the stories of other people, particularly of Christians. And I used to love, going back, 20, 30 years ago, I used to love reading some of the really inspiring stories of people like Corrie ten Boom. Many of you will be familiar with Corrie ten Boom, the Dutch lady who was in a prisoner of war camp in the Second World War. And the exploits they did in order to bring to safety the persecuted Jews, and they paid dearly as a result of getting caught by the Nazis for doing that. But even then, she was used so wonderfully, even in the concentration camps, to just help others. So that's one person. But there are many, many others as well, and all sorts of stories that came out. And it seems that there was just such a real sort of burst of all these different things that came out about this time. Lots of sort of little mini biographies, really, of people and the things they had done. And we were all sort of enjoying them. And it just seemed to me that, every week it seemed almost, there was another story coming out about somebody else. And I remember reading in the Christian Press one day, someone wrote an article about the explosion of stories that are being written, and said basically this. They described that the church in the UK, and probably wider too, but certainly in the UK, the church in the UK had come to rely on book faith. And when I thought about that, I thought, actually I think there's something about that. We were inspired by other people's stories, and yet we'd had no experience ourselves, or very little. We love to hear the stories of people like Corrie ten Boom, Johnny Erickson, of people like Jennifer Rees-Larkham, and many, many others, Max Sinclair, and lots of other names that could come to mind of the people who God had used. Jim Elliot, another name that springs to mind. And we were being built up on hearing what other people had been doing and what God had been doing through those people. But when you start to examine yourself and say, but where is my faith? If I was put in the situation that those people have been put in, how would I have fared? Would I be standing strong? Would I be writing that book? Or would I have collapsed under the pressure that they found themselves under? And I think it was a real question to ask. Was it book faith rather than real faith? And I think actually, in Jesus' time, it might not have been book faith, but I think there was a certain amount of faith that was going around amongst the crowds due to the popularity of Jesus. People were getting swept up in the moment. They had seen Jesus heal. They had heard him teach. They had watched him perform miracles, and huge crowds were following on behind him, hanging on to every word that he said, waiting for him to do the next thing. They wanted to witness it. But what about their own faith? Where was that? And I think that despite the large crowds that followed Jesus, I think faith was quite weak, as we're going to find out in just a moment. So this morning, I just want us to look at the whole idea of taking Christian living from theory into practice or into faith. Because that's actually what we're meant to be doing. And for many of us, Christian living is actually a very mundane thing. I remember David Pawson asking the question very challengingly one day, where he asked the question, he said this, he said, when did you last believe in Jesus? And you have to stop and think about that for a moment. And he said, we all say we believe in Jesus, but you only actually really truly believe in him when you have to rely on him. And quite rightly he pointed out that most of us don't rely on him on a daily basis. Our lives continue. I know we rely on him for our salvation. Yes, that's true. But on a daily basis, do we need to call on his name? I think it's one of the reasons why the church in the West is quite weak, because we don't need to turn to Jesus, to rely on him, to believe in him. That we're okay. We can get through our daily lives without him, it seems. We do all right. We have incomes. We have plenty of food in the shops. We have medical care if we need it. We have all the things around us, a society that's together. We live in peaceful times, relatively speaking. And generally speaking, we can go about our lives without fear, without great concern. And as a result, our faith can become lacking and weak. But sometimes there are people who have to put all their trust in Jesus, all their eggs in one basket, because they say there is no other hope. And that's what we see here today. So let's look at our reading a little more closely. The first bit of our reading this morning was that very popular parable about the house builders, which has been greatly popularized over the year, particularly from those of a certain generation who, as soon as you mention it, have a little song that starts going around in their heads. Now, come on, be honest. Who had that song going around in their heads this morning? There you go. Look, the hands are going up. And that song, it does, doesn't it? From Sunday school days. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rain came tumbling down. And I'm not going to go through the rest of it. And it's a story that very often gets almost reduced to the level of it's just for children. But Jesus didn't tell it to children. Jesus told it to adults. Jesus told a simple story to make a very profound point. And that's the beauty of what Jesus did. He wasn't complicated. And sometimes we pastors and preachers are very guilty of overcomplicating the simple things. And, it's just a fact of life. It happens all the time. But Jesus was the master at simplifying the complicated things. And he said, faith is just like this. He said, depending on me, listening to my word, putting it into practice. He said, you come here, you listen to me. You hear what I say, and this comes in the context really here is right at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, as it's recorded in Matthew's Gospel, or sometimes referred in Luke to as the Sermon on the Plain. And the difference between whether it's the Mount or the Plain doesn't really matter. The location's not important. The point that's important is that Jesus sat down with the crowd, and here this is the longest discourse of continuous teaching that we have from Jesus. And as he comes towards the end of it, he tells this story all about these builders. He says, why is it that you come to me with respect, apparent respect, calling me Lord? In fact, he says, Lord, Lord. He's emphasizing this point. They come to him and they treat him well. They know the right things to say. And they come and they approach him and say, Lord, Lord, what about this? What about that? What about the other? He says, why do you come and do this? But then you contradict yourselves by being disobedient to what I say. If I'm really Lord, in other words, if I'm really Lord, he said, then you obey me, because the Lord is the master. He's the one who is over you. But he said, I tell you things, and you go off and do the opposite. And Jesus was not unaware of the way the hearts of the people were working, even though they followed him, even though they were amazed at his teaching, even though they were really struck by him. There were so many that still went back to their old ways of life. Somehow they still couldn't fully accept and digest what Jesus was saying. He said, why do you do it? Why do you act as hypocrites? If you're going to call me Lord, then treat me as Lord, is what he's saying. And then he tells this very simple little parable to emphasize this point. He said, if you really knew me as Lord, and you really obeyed me, your lives would be built on solid ground. Nothing could shake you. When the storm comes, the fiercest storm, the torrents, the rivers burst their banks. The power of water is incredible, isn't it? When we've seen in recent years pictures of flooding, the damage that it does. I remember watching on YouTube a year or two back, the flooding in I believe it was in Canberra in Australia. And watched someone who from their office had filmed over a number of minutes, about 15 minutes or so, had filmed the river burst its banks, and the power of the water. I mean, not much water really, relatively speaking. I mean, there's the river, it's flowing along and it's fast and furious as it's flowing along. And as the water rises, so it starts to creep over the edge of the bank into the car park. And before you know it, the car park is covered with a layer of water. It doesn't take long before you see cars being picked up, swept down through the car park into one another, down into the river, swept off down the river, and you think, wow, incredible force of nature with a relatively small amount of water flowing along. And Jesus says, sometimes in our lives, it's just like the torrents come. The water flows. Water that in many circumstances can be deadly. But he said, if the foundation is right, if you've dug through the soft layers of sand, the soil that's got no substance to it, right down to the bedrock, and you built from the bedrock up, he said, you've got nothing to fear. He said, and when you listen to my word, and when you obey my word, that's what you're doing. He says, you're clearing away all of the soft materials, the stuff that shifts. And he says, you found the rock and you build upon it. On the other hand, the man who builds without a foundation, he just starts laying bricks and mortar just onto the surface, finds that, he says, once the storm comes, that the earth beneath his home shifts. Before he knows it, the whole thing has collapsed. So a very, very simple illustration. And Jesus is saying that when people, he said, don't listen to me, when they listen to other people, when they build their lives on things that are not certain and are not sure, things that are not eternal, he says you've got to expect them to move. And many of us have found that in our own lives, that we've perhaps at some point or other, we've put our dependency on something that we even looked at and we thought it was solid. I mean, when in the story here, when the builder starts to build on the straight onto the ground beneath, he had no idea of the effect that the storm would have. If he thought there was trouble, or likely to be trouble, there's no way he would have built it. But at the time, when there's no storm, the ground looks firm. And that's very often true in our lives too, that we look around us and we hear what people say and it's okay. All the time there's calm, then what other people say might look solid. Advice that we're given that may not come from the Lord at all may look good advice. And you start to build your life on it, and you start to start hanging on to these words and things, and then suddenly, when trouble comes, these things disappear. Now, we're living in a time of unequaled financial crisis in our generation and longer. There are a lot of people who, before the storm came, put all their trust in the sand. The economy they thought would keep them safe. The investments they made looked like sure things. And yet they discovered that actually even the safest financial decision, or what apparently looks like the safest one, is not necessarily secure. It's been amazing over the last few years to watch some of the companies that everyone would have perhaps imagined to be absolutely rock-solid companies either go completely or get themselves into all sorts of trouble and need shoring up. Banks themselves have even collapsed as a result of what's going on. In fact, already was the trigger of it all anyway. So, there's a lot of uncertainty around even in the things we look at that are solid. Some people look at their own selves, their health, and all the time that we're feeling fit and healthy and there's nothing wrong with us, then we feel that we're on solid ground. And we follow the advice that perhaps we read and we hear about, the popular advice that's around, and if you eat your 5 a day and if you exercise this amount per week and make sure that your heart builds up to a certain sort of beat rate so many times per week, and if you do this and you do that and you do the other, then you've got a good chance of doing well. But of course, as many of us have found out, that sometimes even those of us that take the greatest care of our health get that absolute bomb that drops one day. Something is wrong. Sometimes it's minor. Sometimes it can be very serious. And it can shatter our lives. There are people who put their security in those that are around them. And they say, I'm okay, it's all right, it doesn't matter if things start to go wrong, I have a good family around me. And, they'll support me through it. And then they discover that when things go wrong, when the storm comes, that even the family isn't strong enough to hold. And we could go on, we could think of all sorts of situations. Solid ground that as it appears that we build on and then discover that it goes. Well, Jesus says this. He says, don't put all your dependency on these things. Now, I'm not saying these things are wrong. Please don't mishear me. What I'm saying is this, that if that is your foundation, it's wrong. The foundation has to be the Lord himself. It has to be his word. And when you get that deep into your life, then and only then can you say, now my life is secure. That doesn't mean to say that because you listen to the word of God, because you're obedient to the word of God, because you've built on that solid rock, that trouble won't come. It doesn't mean that you would have been safe in the financial crash. It doesn't mean that your mortgage payments would have been kept up. It doesn't mean that your health is absolutely ring-fenced and that nothing can ever go wrong with it. It doesn't mean that at all. But what it does mean is this, that all of those things suddenly become secondary to the great security that you have in Christ. And you're able to look at these things and say, it's all right. They might be trials that I go through. They might be very difficult times. But actually, what's more important is that I know Christ, that I'm obedient to his word, that I stand firm upon him, and that I know that ultimately my long-term future is absolutely secure. And even in the short term, I know that he'll help me through. He'll give me the strength to cope with the greatest of challenges, all for the glory of God. Now that's the kind of thing that we need to teach as a Christian church. The kind of thing as individual Christians that we need to take hold of, because the rock that we build on really is solid. He does not change. But that's the theory. And Jesus, at this point, is teaching theory. I know that he's challenging those who he recognizes have not been doing so well with their faith and their trust in him. But essentially, it's still only theory. What about putting it into practice? And that's really the second half of what I want to say this morning. Because immediately following this teaching, these people have been sitting there listening to Jesus, going through this whole Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, whichever you want to look at. All this wonderful teaching, simple little parables, wonderful truths that people right to this very day hold on to. And Jesus now says, let's now see it all in practice. And so Luke records that when he had finished saying that, he went into the town of Capernaum, which was his base for his ministry. And as he goes into the town of Capernaum, there is a sick servant of a centurion, a Roman soldier, a Roman officer, a man of great influence and clearly a man of considerable wealth. This man was a friend of the Jews, and he may well have been a God-fearing Roman soldier. There certainly were some around. He was so much a God-fearing type of character that he even donated the money that was needed to build the synagogue in Capernaum. And even to this day, if you go to Capernaum, you can actually still see the foundations of that original synagogue. The ruins that are there are a later one, but underneath you can still see the foundation, a black stone that was laid at that time. And when you go and you look at it, it reminds you of this story. And it's wonderful just to be able to connect with that. But that's an aside. But here, this man, he'd donated money, he'd given to the Jews, he'd given to the community, he'd seen them all right. And the Jews loved him for it. And they said, this is a dear man, he's precious to us. And now his servant is sick. And he needs your help, Lord. He knows that nobody else can help him. He knows that the sickness that this servant is suffering is obviously not a small ailment. This is not a common cold he's got. This is something really quite bad. This is something that, in all likelihood, may possibly end in death. And this man values this servant so much, and he says, I need to keep him. This man's life is precious to me, says the centurion. But what can I do? He's a wealthy man. Therefore, almost certainly, he's already called the doctors in. The doctors have come, they've looked at him, they don't know what to do. They've probably gone about giving him this dose and that dose, and still this man's getting worse. They've tried all the treatments they can on him. Nothing's happening, and this man is just wasting his money now. Not that money was the issue. The issue was that he's beyond the help of the doctor. The issue is that this man is beyond any human help. Only Jesus is left, and this man, this centurion, has heard about Jesus. He's heard about the miracles. He's heard about the healings. He's heard how wonderful Jesus is, and he's heard that he's in town. You can't let an opportunity like that go by. But look, there are two things really that strike me about this. Firstly is that this man does trust in the word of Christ. He trusts in the word of Christ, and he shows it in this way. Firstly, his inadequacy. He didn't go to Jesus himself because he said, I know that Jesus has come to the Jews. I know that he's been sent to the Jewish people. Suggests that this man read his scriptures. It suggests that he had some understanding of the Jewish religion, some understanding of the coming of Messiah, some understanding of God and his chosen people. He had some understanding of this. That seems quite clear. And so he doesn't go to Jesus himself, but instead he sends the Jewish leaders, and by that these would have been the synagogue rulers, the leaders of the Jews in that community. So he's got connection still with the synagogue. He's built the synagogue. He's paid for it. And now he sent the leaders and he said, go on my behalf, please. You are senior Jews in this community. Please go to this amazing Jew, this amazing miracle-working Jew and teacher, and ask him to have compassion on me, to come to my house, to come and meet my servant, and to heal him. And so the Jews do just that. They go to him. They go to Jesus. They go and they ask. And Jesus, being persuaded by them, makes his way towards the centurion's home. Now somebody has run on ahead. And they've run back to the centurion. They said, Jesus is coming. It's all right. Jesus is coming. And suddenly this man has got such a sense of his inadequacy. And he says, I'm not worthy of having Jesus. I might be some great Roman soldier, high-ranking, well-respected, but I don't deserve to have the Messiah come under my roof. And I believe that he recognized that Jesus was the Messiah. I don't deserve that. I'm not one of God's chosen people. No, you must stop him. You must not trouble this Messiah anymore. Go back to him and say to him, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you. Jesus, still on the way, is met by the friends of the centurion who've just come straight back from the house with the message. Jesus, please stop. Don't go any further. We have a message from our master. You don't need to come. He doesn't deserve you. Do you know, I think that it would be helpful if more of us had a sense of our own inadequacy. Not an inferiority, but inadequacy. We're all equal in God's sight. That's why it's not inferiority. And sometimes as Christians we get that wrong, don't we? Let's be honest about it. Very often we have this sense of our superiority in the face of God, because we've been brought into the family of Christ, because we've been adopted as children, that we have this special relationship with him, and those people around us that don't have that, somehow they're not on the same. Look, that's wrong. The Lord loves each and every one of us equally. There's no inferiority, superiority situation here. But there is a sense of my inadequacy. I do not deserve to come to the cross of Christ. But by his grace, he's allowed me there. I do not deserve to have my sins forgiven. But by his mercy, he's washed me clean. I do not deserve to have any outpouring of God's blessing upon my life. But because of his great love for us, his loving kindness, he loves to pour out his blessing, his good gifts upon his children. It's nothing to do with me. I am completely inadequate. It's all to do with him. But we need to keep hold of that idea that I deserve nothing except the anger, the wrath of God upon me. By his mercy, he's found another way. But secondly, I want you to notice that if on the one hand we have the inadequacy of the centurion in the face of Christ, we have the sufficiency of Christ, which is verbalized by the centurion by the word authority. And he says, you don't need to come to my house, Lord, because I too am a man under authority. And what he means is this. He's saying, I understand authority. He says, I am under authority, therefore I say to this man, go here, and he goes, come here, and he comes. He says, I'm in the military. I'm a soldier. And I am under authority, and that authority has given me authority in order to give orders to these people that are under my authority. And they obey me because of it. It's not because of who I am as a person, but who I am because of the authority that's been given to me. And he says, I recognize, he said, that you too are under authority. That's why I believe that he knew that Jesus is the Messiah. I believe that he had recognized that Jesus is not just some ordinary person, he's not just an ordinary teacher, he's not a prophet, but he is the one who's been sent by God. He's the anointed one, the chosen one of God. And this man says, you, he says, are under the authority of the Almighty himself, and therefore you can say the word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus did just that. But the story doesn't finish there, because Jesus then, it tells us that towards the end of our reading this morning, verses 9 and 10, let's just reread them. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at the centurion and turned to the crowd following him. This is the crowd that he'd just been teaching. This is the crowd who Jesus had to rebuke because they say, Lord, Lord, and do not do what he says. And he turns to the crowd following him and said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel, even among the chosen ones of the Lord, even among the ones to whom I've been sent, the ones who've received the word of the Lord. I've never found such great faith. And then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. This man's faith was indeed rewarded because he understood authority. See, and we need to understand the authority that the Lord has upon our own lives. We need to understand that the Lord does for us things because of his authority or his sufficiency, because he is able, because he has all the power to do so when we have none of the power. And therefore our hands are completely in his hands. We have to trust him in everything. I really wanted to encourage us to do that today. And from this time forward, it doesn't matter what situations we face. Do we really believe that Jesus is the one under authority? Jesus said many times, I do nothing of my own accord. I only do what I hear from the Father. I'm under authority. The power that's been given to me has come from the Father. And now he says, I pass it on to you. We are people who are under the authority, and as such, we still have work to do as well. We have things that we can do because the authority chain passes down. So we're not helpless people anymore. We might be inadequate, just as the centurion realized that he was inadequate. But he also realized he was a man under authority, and if you put your faith and your trust in Christ, you are also a person under authority. Which means that you can go and live your life listening to what the Lord says, putting into practice what he tells you to do, being obedient to his word, and you will see the glory of God at work in your own life too. Let's just pray.